Product Officer and CISO of XYPRO Technology. We're a global cybersecurity company headquartered in Southern California. Today we're going to be discussing security contextualization and how we combat risk with actionable data. We'll discuss why context is important in today's cybersecurity world, what context is in its most molecular level, and some of the challenges that go along with not having context, and how we can apply context to keep up with current cybersecurity threats. A little bit about myself. I've been in the cybersecurity field for nearly 20 years. I started my career developing applications, both good and maybe ones that would be frowned upon today. I later moved into SOC management and training. I've also served as a CISO and a cybersecurity evangelist. And in my current role as Chief Product Officer, my main focus is threat detection, data privacy, and compliance for large multinational organizations. Plus, I get to work with some great new technology and play with some people might consider, air quotes, internet cop, and in a constantly evolving industry with some of the coolest people in the world. Okay, let's jump into it. It can take months or even years before a data breach is detected. Taking a look at some statistics from the Ponemon Institute's 2018 Cost of Data Breach report, it takes an average of 197 days to identify a breach. That's an average. That means someone is in your network, on your systems, in your applications, doing what they want, when they want, how they want it, for over 6 months before they're detected. And that is if they're detected. On the higher end of the spectrum, there are companies that have been breached for years before they realize it. For example, sources say the Marriott data breach occurred back in 2014, but it wasn't realized until 2018. The scale of that breach is still being evaluated, and it seems to be getting bigger and bigger and more impactful as more information keeps coming out. So why is this the case? Most companies have all of the data they need to detect a breach. All of the attacker's activities are in the audit files, log files, and other sources of data required by security frameworks, compliance policies, and other corporate mandates. Yet it still takes over 6 months to detect. It all comes down to the data. In 2019, data is being generated at a volume and velocity never seen before. All of these devices and applications are creating their own audit trails at a high rate of speed. Attackers know this. They know if they can be patient and hide their activity in the volume of data as innocuous user behavior, as everyday user activity, and make their activity look like your typical corporate user activity, chances are their activity is going to go undetected. It's becoming harder and harder for humans to search through all of that data, all of that log data, to find a needle in the haystack while more hay is being piled on. Another eye-opening statistic, half of the time it's not the company themselves that can identify the breach, yet they're sitting on all of the evidence needed to identify. They receive a call from their customers or a bank or a financial institution, the FBI or another external entity notifying them of the activity. Some have even read it in the news before they realize that they've been breached. Taking a look at some additional statistics from the Ponemon report, it's no secret that the longer a data breach goes undetected, the more expensive it's going to be. In 2018, the average cost of a data breach was nearly $4 million US. Like an undiagnosed illness or an issue with a car, the longer a problem remains undetected, the more damage and more expensive it can be. For large organizations, that number can be in the tens of millions of dollars or larger. For a small business, a data breach could be the difference between staying in business and having to close your doors and go out of business. Unfortunately, small businesses are often unaware that a compromise has occurred until a third party, like we discussed, informs them. This can happen, for example, a bank or financial institution suddenly sees a rise in cardholder fraud and traces the source back to a single merchant. More than 70% of attacks target small businesses, and an estimated 60% of those businesses that experience an attack will go under and go out of business within 6 months. Businesses that operate in retail, food and beverage, hospitality, and other like industries are the ones most susceptible to a compromise. 1/3 of small businesses do not have the right tools or resources in place to protect a breach. This is like a perfect storm. Attackers know this and use it to their advantage. Small businesses are low-hanging fruit. That's why we've seen such a sudden spike in ransomware attacks. The necessary protections are missing, making it far too easy for attackers to get in, get the money, and get out. Attackers are asking for ransom that is just large enough to make it worth their time and hurt the business just enough to make any business owner give security a second serious thought. So how are these breaches occurring? The study found that 48% of attacks are still coming through external cyber criminals, or interestingly enough, they're coming through malicious insiders. Malicious insiders are employees that have responsibilities within an organization who are misusing their trust or access. It's important to be aware of this type of threat because it's typically very difficult to detect and often takes a long time to discover. The malicious insider threat is a hard one to detect because we typically trust our employees. If an employee is working with sensitive data as part of their job, it's difficult to determine if they're doing anything malicious with the level of access that they have or the data they have access to. Even if you suspect malicious intent, it's easy for employees to claim that they made a mistake and get away with it. It's almost impossible to prove guilt in these cases. It's also pretty easy for employees, especially tech-savvy ones, to cover their tracks. Being aware of certain factors and indicators can help you determine if you have a malicious insider inside of your organization. This can be activities, for example, copying or accessing data or deleting data from certain locations, transferring information through file uploads or emails, or copying data to a USB drive, changes to file locations or permissions within an application, enabling terminated employee accounts and making them active again, or accessing unauthorized areas of the system. Every one of these activities in themselves could be benign. Every one of these activities in themselves are going to be logged in audit files, data files like we talked about. This is where we need context to help paint a broader picture. For example, taking a look at what could potentially drive a malicious insider. They're often driven by greed, by anger, by lack of recognition, by ideology, financial need, compulsive behavior, and much more. This is context. Looking at all these factors, these characteristics, and these behaviors, then seeing if a pattern emerges. It could be that they're just ambitious. Context will help you recognize the difference. Typically, all of these log files, audit files, and other sources of data that contain security activity are aggregated into a central log management solution called a SIEM, or a Security Incident and Event Manager. This is Splunk, IBM QRadar, Logarithm, Alien Vault, Elk Stack, your Elastic, Logarithm Kibana Stack, and there are quite a few others out there as well. SIEMs are extremely good at collating, storing, collecting, normalizing, and reporting on large amounts of big data. And this is necessary. This is needed. The challenge recently has been as data has increased, devices have increased, activity has increased, SIEM technology has shown its limitations. As we talked about earlier in the presentation, all of the evidence required to identify a breach are in your log files, which means all of the data needed to identify a breach is in the SIEM. Yet it's still taking on average over 6 months to detect a breach. SIEMs are great at alerting and reporting on binary values and thresholds. But unless SIEMs are aware of what to report on, they don't know what they don't know. So unless you have a resource that's sitting there actively programming additional rules and alerts and thresholds, or the SIEM is downloading signatures and rules and updates from an external location, it can't alert on what it doesn't know. Newer strategies such as threat hunting, analytics, and intelligence have come later on and added to the scope of what the SIEM should be doing but can't do well. So these companies are innovating and spending money and time and resources at an extremely rapid pace trying to get the technology to keep up, but there's obviously still a gap. Also, a SIEM-only reliant security strategy is not sustainable. This leads to a false sense of security that your SIEM is the ultimate authority on security threat detection and reporting on alerts. Unfortunately, SIEM technology is limited by the types of data and devices it's aware of on which it can alert. So if it doesn't have context, it doesn't know what the data means, it's not going to be able to tell you what to do with it. When I talk about the need to complement the SIEM with other types of newer technology, I personally have heard a lot of security professionals respond with, yes, but my SIEM should be doing that. Even when the most basic mandatory signatures and rules are applied, SIEMs alert on way too many events that are neither suspicious nor urgent. You don't really want to be alerted on every possible incident. You don't want to receive 400 alerts that a user failed to log on. Which one are you going to pay attention to and which one are you going to ignore? It's tough. It is an impossible task to investigate all of them, so ultimately there would never be any progress. You want to identify in real time security events driven by actual malicious activity, things that you need to pay attention to. Massive amounts of raw data also impact the quality of SIEM responses. SIMs without environmental and industry context are not able to detect what's business as usual versus unusual but acceptable activity versus what's a legitimate and potential threat. The unavoidable alert overload means your security folks eventually tune out all of these alerts, making it easy for malicious activities to slip by. This makes the SIM something used only when looking back for analysis and forensics. Obviously, if you're using the SIM to investigate or only investigate or report on, you're looking backwards, which means you're already too late. Now, I'm not saying SIMs aren't needed. In fact, SIMs are excellent at what they do and are necessary in nearly every environment. It's the only way you're going to be able to collect all of your security data and report on it from a central location. But the types of threats we're dealing with in 2019 have evolved to surpass what the SIM was meant to do. So what do we have to do about it, or what can we do about it? We have to continue relying on SIMs and other similar technology, but complemented with newer information, newer sources of context to build visibility into the data that we already have. So given the challenges we described, what's being done to address the gap? Over the last several years, a lot of innovation has gone into correlation technology. This is an area where solutions like Splunk excel at. Correlation takes two things and identifies a relationship between them. This can be in the same data stream, or it can be across disparate data silos. For example, this slide shows two separate data sources. The one on the left is a Linux server. The one on the right is an event from a Windows server. Correlation will scan through all of the data elements to identify a common relationship between these two events. In this particular example, the one on the left, we can see a failed logon event to an account called Mr. Hacker from the IP address 222.65.44.22. The event on the right, we can see a logon event from a Windows server from that same IP address. This means there's a relationship between these two events. We can now correlate these two events to create a relationship between the failed logon attempt on the left-hand Linux server and the successful logon on the right-hand Windows server based on the IP address that appears in both events. Correlating data as quickly as possible is a key activity to breach identification. The technology needed to correlate has dramatically evolved recently. Previously, this would be a manual task of having to export data or log files into Excel files and then having to sort through or grep through data in various ways. Now the machines do it all for us faster than any human can ever do. And they do it across what was previously considered siloed data. The challenge now becomes, what do you do with this new information? It's great that we're able to identify a relationship between two events on two different systems, but now how can we provide meaning to this newly formed data to understand if this is something that we need to pay attention to or if it's a new type of event that can be ignored? This is where context becomes critically necessary. Context is an easy concept to understand, but it's very difficult to apply using technology. Context can tell us if this IP address, if this is an IP address we've ever seen in our network before. Or is this IP address known to have a malicious reputation? Is Mr. Hacker an account that exists on my systems? Has this IP address failed to access any other accounts in the past? Or has this IP address tried to log on to any other systems? What was the result? This list can go on and on, but the more of these additional sources of information we have to evaluate, the more context we have, the better we're positioned to act on this newly correlated data. I want to strip away the technology aspect of this conversation for a minute and focus on context itself. What is context? As I mentioned earlier, context is an easy concept to understand. We use it every day in our lives. Context is any information about any entity that can be used to reduce the amount of reasoning required for decision making. Context essentially filters out all of the irrelevant noise to allow you to focus on what is important. Ultimately, it transforms data into hopefully useful information. Context is something, as I mentioned, that we use in every part of our lives, especially in language. For example, every word that's coming out of my mouth right now is data. And as you're listening to me, you're using context to turn my words and information into information, oddly enough, about a presentation about context. In terms of language, there's two types of context markers. There are cultural context, there's a concept of cultural context and situational context. Cultural context are things like personal backgrounds, experiences people have gone through, their roots and heritage, the history of themselves, their family, their culture, etc. Then there is situational context. Who's involved in the conversation, the background of the participants and what they bring, the theme of the conversation itself, where the conversation is taking place. The combination of these two types of context markers is what's referred to as universal discourse. You know, based on the description of this presentation shared by the EC Council, that this is a security contextualization related presentation. At the start of this presentation, I introduced myself and gave a summary of my background. I mentioned I start off developing applications that may have been used for not so ideal purposes. This gives you an understanding that I may know what I'm talking about with regards to this topic, although some of the people that know me may beg to differ. I'm kidding. All of this information about myself, my experiences, and the description of the presentation give you context to apply to the words that are coming out of my mouth. This allows you to focus that these particular words have to do with security and contextualization. I want to use another example of context that shows up in our lives every day. I'm sure by now we're all familiar with those ads that show up in our Facebook feeds based on what we search for in Amazon or Google or another website. Although by now it feels like I can simply think of something and the ad seems to show up in my Facebook feed. That's scary. How do they know this, and how do they target me, Steve, directly? This is done by years and years of science going back to the Mad Men days. But now it's mostly based on data. Think about it. If you know nothing about your audience, it's extremely complicated, if not downright impossible, to market anything to them. That's why the importance of data can't be overstated. Big data is a term that's been thrown around a lot the last few years. And while artificial intelligence and machine learning are opening up even more avenues for data gathering, you need to understand that the value of data can only be measured around its usefulness. That's why the term intelligent data is a better way of looking at it. Using Facebook as an example, Mr. Zuckerberg knows how old I am, where I live, where I work, where I visit, who my family and friends are, what my hobbies are. Heck, he probably at this point knows more about me than I do. All of this information can be used to filter out things that are irrelevant to me, Steve, and to focus advertising on things that I would find interesting and get me to act or purchase. The more personal the experience becomes, the more inclined the person will be to engage with the ad. If I see an ad that says, "Hey Steve, check out these cool new fishing poles," I might take a click at that and see what's going on. Another example I like to point out is how we use Yelp. This weekend, me and my daughter went out to eat. I pulled up Yelp on my phone, and it listed about 30 restaurants around us. We were in the mood for barbecue, so I filtered out any restaurant that wasn't barbecue and wasn't of 4 or 5 stars. I found something within walking distance of where we were. We had a spectacular meal. In this example, the restaurants themselves are the data. The user reviews, the ratings, and the proximity to where I was is the applied context. The result was I was able to find a 5-star barbecue restaurant that I could walk to. To me, I applied context, which turned the data into information and resulted in an action. Okay, so this is where the rubber meets the road. Context or contextual information is any information about an entity that can be used to effectively reduce the amount of reasoning required for decision making within the scope of that topic. This can be done via filtering, aggregation, inference, or other types of similar methodologies. Contextualization excludes irrelevant data from consideration that has the potential to reduce data from several aspects, including volume, velocity, and the impacts of big data. Generating alerts by simply correlating log data from devices without some sort of validation generally results in a flood of alerts. Because the alerts were generated without validation, security teams must validate the alerts themselves. Given the number of events in a queue, you probably can't afford to spend more than a few minutes to decide if an alert represents a true threat to your organization. This massive backlog of alerts leads to stressed out security teams with lower morale. On top of that, many of the alerts are likely to be false positives, as SIMs are known to flag alerts based on what we call indicators of compromise, or IOCs, which need further investigation. This approach in turn leads to an increased mean time to identify, hence the 6 months it takes to identify a breach. So correlation algorithms without security context is just linking data together without meaning. The various appliances in your network, the various appliances, platforms, applications in your network should be constantly generating event logs that are fed to your SIM. A SIM correlation algorithm tells your SIM which sequence of events it could be indicative of anomalies, which may suggest security weaknesses or a cyber attack. For example, when X and Y or X and Y plus Z happens, somebody should be notified. This is an example of a SIM correlation rule, which can illustrate this concept. So we're trying to detect new DHCP servers that enter the network by watching for inside and outside connections, which use UDP packets, have port 67 as the destination, and have a destination IP address that isn't registered on our IP list. So we'll watch for UDP packets that are going in and out of our network. We'll see if those ports are targeting or if those packets are targeting port 67 anywhere on our network, and then we're going to check out the destination IP address. This will generate an alert. This is pretty simple to do with correlation algorithms currently, as we're just looking for a sequence. What we want to do is apply context to this and understand what IP addresses are involved in this, what users are involved in this, what networks are involved in this. Has this activity happened over time or before? That will provide additional scope and understanding into this alert. Another more simplified example would be when it comes to failed logons. So what we want to do is monitor failed logons that are attempting to log in, trying different usernames from the same IP address, and we want to time box that within 15 minutes. So if we see 5 or more failed logons using different usernames to a single IP address within 15 minutes, followed by a successful logon, we want to send out an alert. Again, this is a sequence of events that can be done via correlation algorithms, but if we get a bunch of these, it's going to be hard to decipher which one is legitimate and could be a user who just forgot their username, which is very, very common. Or they forgot their password and they remembered their password and were able to log on, compared to somebody who's actually trying to brute force your network. Context and providing those additional sources of data to provide the context will filter out the noise and focus your energy on the types of events that you need to pay attention to. So what are the types of context that need to be considered? There's multiple types of context that can be applied, and the more you apply, the more intelligent your decision-making process can become. For example, there's the concept of internal context. This is contextual information about internal systems, for example, the system's business function, its importance, its location, what data and assets it houses. Context about internal systems help an analyst understand if the observed attack is even relevant to the target system, as well as help them prioritize the incident. For example, is this potential attack against a production server, or is it a visitor on the guest network? Then there's external context. Given that only an IP address is included in most events, external context can help attribute who owns that IP address and its geolocation. Reputable threat intelligence companies are helpful in understanding more about the attacker, the attacker's intent, or if other organizations have been targeted. You can then correlate that IP address and understand if it's ever been used in any other attacks, if it's blacklisted, if it's known to be a malicious IP address. This is what adds context from an external sense. And then there's the context, and then there's the context of behavioral analysis. This is understanding how, for example, a system administrator or a database administrator is supposed to function in your environment. This is profiling a user over a given amount of time to understand what's normal for that user, for that group, for that system, to be able to identify what's not normal to them, and then applying that understanding to their activity. This can be based on historical patterns of behavior and associations of the systems, and account help corroborate if any observed activity is malicious or just normal user behavior. Incidents typically unfold over time, involve multiple data sources, and malicious users will attempt to live off the land as they pivot around your network, meaning they're going to try and attempt to hide within authorized activity. They're going to make their behavior look like innocuous user behavior. But ultimately, they're going to slip up and do something that your user is not accustomed to doing. This can be, for example, a user logs into their workstation every day. First thing they do is open up their Outlook. Second thing they do is open up their Chrome and go to 3 routine websites. Third thing they'll do is get up after 4 minutes, go get a cup of coffee. So their system sits idle for 10 minutes. An attacker might do those 4 or 5 things, but might do it in out of sequence. Now we have an understanding of user behavior. We've profiled the user and understand what's normal to them, so we can identify what's not normal to them. This is applying context to events and sequence patterns that allow us to identify or separate the signal from the noise. So in summary, we need to tackle these modern security problems with modern solutions. Based on the volume and velocity of the data and the gap in technology, it's become far too easy for cybercriminals and malicious insiders to hide their activity in normal user behavior. SIMs are a necessary first step to helping address the challenge, but we need correlation technology to piece the data together. This has still left us with a 6+ month mean time to identify. This is where we need to apply other newer, more complementary solutions. For example, other sources of information or context to transform our data into actionable information. We use context in nearly every part of our lives and businesses. Applying context to security should not be any different. This will help separate actionable data from the noise. Ultimately, contextualized data will help improve our decision-making process, which will help reduce operational costs by increasing the efficiency of our resources, all of which will reduce our mean time to identify a breach, allowing us to respond much faster to keep the impact and the cost associated with a breach down. So in short, I hope that was very helpful to get an understanding of what contextualization in the security world means. This is an area I can go on and on about. I'm very passionate about being able to refine data and make it very actionable. I've written plenty of articles and blogs, and I've done presentations at security events, and it's just something I enjoy talking about. If you want to hear more on this topic, please feel free, reach out, email me, follow me on Twitter, LinkedIn. I'm happy to follow up and provide more information and more insight on this. That takes us to the end of our presentation for today. I'll pause here and take an opportunity to take questions or any comments you may have. So thank you, everybody. I hope you enjoyed the content.